Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me this morning. My name's Gillian McAteer and I'm Head of Employment Law at Citation. And this morning I'm going to be talking about the new flexible furlough scheme, which gets up and running from the 1st of July. And I'll be answering any questions you may have about the changes and about how this may impact on your business. But I thought before we start looking at the questions, it might be useful to recap on how the scheme is changing and how these rules are going to operate in practice. Now, at the end of May, the Chancellor announced that the furlough scheme was going to be changing to allow this flexibility, which he very much saw as being a bridge to allow businesses get back to work after lockdown. And we had some very sketchy details of what this would involve. And at the weekend, HMRC produced some further guidance on how this was going to work in practice. So we now have got quite a clear timetable about how it will be changing. And the most significant change comes in on the 1st of July, which is for the first time, it will allow employers to bring employees back into work on any hours and on any working pattern that's going to meet the needs of their business. And then they can still then claim furlough subsidy for the hours that they're not able to offer them work. So that's changing from the 1st of July, and that's really the only significant change to the scheme because there will not be any changes to the financial setup of the scheme. They come in from the 1st of August, and from the 1st of August and then throughout the life of the scheme, employers are going to take responsibility for paying employers' national insurance contributions and also the minimum auto-enrolment pension contributions that they need to pay for the period of furlough. So that will start from the 1st of August. Then on the 1st of September, the government is going to reduce the contribution that they pay towards wage costs. So currently, of course, that's 80%. That will be reduced to 70% from the 1st of September. But the amount the employee should receive when on furlough will remain 80%, and that 10% shortfall will be made up by the employer. And then on the 1st of October, they will further reduce their contribution from 70% to 60%, and the employer will make up that shortfall of 20%. So the amount the employee receives on furlough remains at 80% throughout. And then on the 31st of October, the scheme is coming to an end. So that's a set timetable we now have, but there are some points to consider about how these new rules are going to work. First of all, in relation to the people you can actually claim for. Effectively now, this scheme is closed to all new entrants. So if from the 1st of July you want to use a flexible furlough scheme, you can only apply for someone who is you've previously furloughed for 3 consecutive weeks at some time between the 1st of March to the 30th of June. So it's got to be someone who's already been in the scheme. Now, there is one exception to that, and that is if on the 10th of June, which was the last cut-off point for putting new entrants onto the scheme, the person that you want to put on furlough was either on maternity leave or some other statutory family-related leave, such as parental leave, etc. Now, if they were on such leave at that time, on the 10th of June, and you have previously furloughed at least one other worker at some point between the 1st of March and the 30th of June for 3 consecutive weeks, you'll be able to add that person to the scheme when they come back. So that is an exception. But other than that, it is now closed to new entrants. There also is going to be a requirement, just as there was when you put employees on furlough in the first instance, that you reach agreement with your employees that they were going to be working under these new arrangements. Now, it's got to be said that the details in the guidance published over the weekend was very sketchy on this. The employee's guide to the scheme makes reference to the fact that your employer will have to reach agreement with you with regard to the new flexible arrangements. The employer's guide just refers generally to an agreement. We're probably going to get a lot more detail when the Treasury releases a direction on the change to the scheme. But what we have tended to find is that there's quite a lag between the HMRC's direction or guidance and the Treasury directions, which tend to come much later. So I would say to take a cautious approach on this, and let's assume that it's not going to be something which you just do a letter saying, by the way, the scheme is changing to your employees. You should actually contact them if you want to put them on flexible furlough and explain how the scheme is changing and get their agreement to operate on that basis, and send a letter out confirming that agreement, because it will be an agreement that needs to be evidenced in writing. Yesterday we were redrafting a lot of agreements for clients to use depending on the circumstances. So for example, if you don't want to bring people back on a part-time basis, if you're content to keep people fully furloughed, and by that I mean that they do no work for you whatsoever, you can just still use your existing agreement. If you have got a set date when you want people to come back, for example, if you think, right, I've been waiting for this, I've got some work for people to do, but so from the 1st of July, I want them to come back and start working 2 days a week or whatever, then it's important that you get that agreement reached now, so you can operate on that basis from the 1st of July. If you think, well, I don't really know what I'm going to need, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges for business, is it's also unpredictable at the moment, but you want to be able to respond quickly to changes in demand, it might be a good idea to get the employees' agreement now and just explain in your discussions with them and in the covering letter that you plan to bring them back to work as quickly as you can. At the moment, you don't know when that's going to be, but you're getting their agreement that they will operate on that basis, and you'll bring them back as soon as you can. The key thing is to make sure that you retain as much flexibility for yourself as possible, because it may, there's going to be very few businesses, I think, that are going to say with certainty, this is the working pattern I'm going to bring people back on, and I'm going to stick to that. The whole point about this is it's meant to be entirely flexible. And that's reflected in the next significant change, which is the change to the furlough period. Under the current scheme, there is a requirement that employees have got to be furloughed for a minimum period of 3 weeks. From the 1st of July, there is no minimum period of furlough. And as I say, I think this is, again, very much to make sure that it's as flexible for businesses as possible, so people can react very quickly to the needs of the business. But one thing to bear in mind with that is that we still operate under the current rules until the 30th of June. And so therefore, if you were to put someone on furlough, say for example on the 25th of June, they could not then move on to flexible furlough on the 1st of July, because they've started that period of furlough under the old rules, so they need to work their 3 consecutive weeks of furlough. Of course, you could put them on flexible furlough from the 1st of June, but it would mean that you couldn't claim furlough from the 25th of June till the end of June, because that wouldn't be classed as a period of furlough under the current scheme rules. Also, what will be changing from the 1st of July is the position with regard to the claim period. At the moment, there's very few restrictions in this. So, for example, you could submit a claim for a furlough subsidy now and backdate it till the 1st of March. So it can span calendar months, etc. That's going to be changing. So the significant changes from the 1st of July is the introduction of a minimum claim period. That's going to be a week from now on. So there's a 7 days minimum claim period. Secondly, the start date and end date of the claim need to be in the same calendar month. So you can't have a claim period which spans calendar months. And thirdly, there will be an exception to the 7-day rule, and that is where the claim period is either at the beginning or the end of a month, a calendar month, and the employer has made a claim for the immediately preceding period. So, for example, if you put employees on furlough, say, for example, on the 14th of July, and the furlough period ended on the 4th of August, you couldn't claim from the 14th of July for the 4th of August from the 1st of July, because that will be spanning 2 calendar periods, which is not permitted. You would have to claim from the 14th of July to the 31st of July, and then put in a separate claim from the 1st to the 4th of August. Now, although that's 7 days, you'll have met the criteria for the exception because it's the beginning of the month and you have made a claim for the period immediately prior to that. Another thing to bear in mind as well is for all furlough claims before the 30th of June must end on the 30th of June. So there's going to be a clean break in terms of the current scheme and the new scheme. So any claims that you have in for people who are furloughed, you must bring that claim to an end on the 30th of June. Obviously, you can then have a new claim period from the 1st of July, and you will only have until the 31st of July to actually submit those claims. So that's important to have those dates in mind. They've also introduced a new requirement that from the 1st of July, the maximum number of, or the number of employees that you claim for in a particular claim can't exceed the maximum number of employees you claimed at any time during the period up to the 30th of June. So up to the 30th of June, if the maximum number of employees you claimed for example, was 15, you will not be able to claim in one claim for more than 50 employees from the 1st of July, unless the additional people are people who were on family, statutory related family leave, maternity leave, parental leave, etc. In those circumstances, you can add, but other than that, there will be that cap on it. So in terms of the basis of the furlough pay calculation, if people are continuously and fully furloughed, you don't need to worry about it. You'll be able to claim exactly as you've done before on the 80% as you have been doing. If, however, they're on flexible furlough, the basis of the calculation will be looking at what the employee's usual hours were, and then deducting from that the actual hours that they worked. And then that will give you the furloughed hours, and then you claim 80% of those hours in terms of wage costs. Now, of course, then it's important to assess what the usual hours are, and that for someone who is working contracted hours is going to be very straightforward. You are going to look at the pay period immediately prior to the 19th of March. What were their contracted hours? What were their contracted hours at that time? Whatever those set hours, those will be their usual hours for the purposes of the calculation. For employees who work variable hours, it is rather more complex. And your starting point is going to be looking at either the average number of hours worked in the tax year 2019 to 2020, or the number of hours worked in the corresponding calendar period for the tax year 2019 to 2020, and you would take the higher of those two figures, and that will be your starting point for usual hours. There's lots of quite complex calculations in the guidance to show you how to do that, and of course there is a calculator as well when you submit your claim that is helpful for that. You will also find that there are going to be some changes to the maximum cap. So obviously at the minute, the maximum cap is £2,500. This will be changing in two ways. First of all, it will be changing in September and October. That cap will be reduced to reflect the fact that the government is reducing its contribution. So the cap in September is reducing to £2,187.50. That's the maximum monthly cap in September. And in October, it's reducing to £1,875. But also the cap will change depending on the amount of hours which are being furloughed. So for example, if your employee is only furloughed for 60% of their usual working hours, they will be entitled to claim up to 60% of the maximum cap at that time. So it's got to stay in proportion to the amount of hours they're actually furloughed. Just a few final points to look at in terms of the actual running of the scheme rules. In addition to the usual documentation that you have got to retain at the moment, you will also need to retain details of the employee's usual hours worked and the calculation you use to arrive at that figure, and also a record of the actual hours worked. So it's important that you retain those records, and they, like all other records, should be retained for a period of 6 years. And finally, I think it's also very, very important to be mindful of the fact of the number of hours, how you're actually calculating it, and the number of hours the employee is actually working. So at the minute, and this will continue to be the case, you can claim for a period which is up to 14 days in advance. But if you are putting down an estimation of the hours you think the employee will work during that period, it's very important that that estimation is accurate, because the entitlement will be based on actual hours worked. So, for example, if you think the employee is going to work 20 hours and actually they end up during that period working 25 hours, your calculation is going to be wrong and you've received an overpayment. And it's very important that HMRC are notified of this. They have made this easier now because each time you make a claim, you will be asked whether you need to make any adjustments. So that would be the time to do it, by actually correcting your previous error, and then you'll have a record of that adjustment, and that should be retained for 6 years. If it is your final claim that you have made an error on, HMRC are currently looking at how that can be rectified, and they're going to produce guidance on that shortly. But that is very, very important that you make sure that you keep a record of that. If you have underclaimed, if you think that, for example, if you thought you were going to be able to give them 20 hours of work, and in fact you only give them 10 hours of work, you need to get in touch with HMRC, because they'll want to do some additional checks before they actually rectify that payment. So I think that really covers some of the principles behind the new rules. Now let's get to your questions. So I've got one here. If an employee normally works 32 hours over 4 days, can we bring them back to work 16 hours, working flexibly over those 4 days, and still claim 2 days furlough? Yes, well, there's absolutely no problem in bringing them back on whatever working pattern and whatever number of hours you want. The only issue I think you'd need to be concerned about there, if you're talking about the employees working flexibly, is there's quite a wide margin of error there for getting the figures wrong. So, for example, if you're saying, they're going to work, generally speaking, 4 hours a day, it's very easy for employees to actually go over that, and especially if they're doing it flexibly. So there might be quite a significant gap between the hours you're claiming for and the hours they're actually working. And then what that would mean is, in fact, that the hours you have said they're furloughed, they've actually been working. Because, of course, its usual hours has got to be split between those on furlough and those working. So the more hours they're working, the less hours they are genuinely on furlough. So I think rather than just leaving it to the employee to work as and when they want to make up those 16 hours, it would be good to actually put in some rules as to when they would be working, and impress upon them the importance that they actually stick to that, so you don't inadvertently end up overclaiming. So Ellie's asked, do we have to specify days and hours for flexible furlough? Well, the agreement to flexible furlough, as I say, should be drafted in such a way that the employee appreciates that this will fluctuate. So you don't have to, when you're getting the agreement to flexible furlough, say this is the working pattern which is going to continue. So say for example you had someone who was coming back. Let's say it's now the second week in July, flexible furlough is available to you, and you've decided that you have got work available from the third week in July. you would get the employees to agree to the flexible furlough. You would say, I'd like you to come back on such and such a date, and you would tell them what that working pattern is, but you would want to make it very, very clear in the letter that actually the whole basis of flexible furlough is that it may fluctuate. You'll give them as much work as possible, but demand is unpredictable. So there may continue to be times when they'll be fully furloughed. There may be times when they have more work, but maybe times that they'll have less work. You'll try to give them as much notice as possible, but obviously it is an unpredictable environment at the minute. So if you have got a set pattern, yes, let them know, because that would be reasonable. But it's got to be clear that you are not committing to sticking to that, because what you don't want to do is to have a situation where they're coming back on one and the expectation of one set of terms, and then you have to keep continuously renewing the agreement to flexibly furlough. Michelle has asked, for previously furloughed staff, can we still put them back on furlough for all their hours, not just part-time? Yes, absolutely. Again, as long as they are not new entrants to the scheme, so you've had them on furlough by the 10th of June, you can bring them back on whatever hours you need them to work, obviously assuming that they're within the band of their original hours. And then if you need to put them back on fully furloughed, that's fine. It's just important that your agreement confirms that. Gemma has said, my staff have been on furlough since April, but returned part-time on 1st of June. What can I do about that? Well, Gemma, the good news is because that as long as they've served their 3 continuous weeks of furlough, the fact that you have brought them back part-time already, they don't need to be on furlough by the 30th of June. They just needed to have been furloughed at some point between the 1st of March and the 30th of June. So, for example, now you've had them on furlough previously. I'm assuming that they've done their 3 consecutive weeks. They're working part-time now. You could put them on furlough, on flexible furlough, which would mean they can work for you. You would pay them as normal, of course, for the hours that they're actually working for you. And you can now claim the furlough subsidy for the period that they are, the shortfall in their normal working hours. George has asked, we shut the business and furloughed all staff during March. We reopened to most staff in May, but left 6 on furlough. Can we flexi furlough more than 6 staff in July or August? So if in March you furloughed all staff, so that will be fine. You can't go above the maximum you had previously. Now, as you had furloughed all staff at some point, your maximum ceiling is going to be very high. It doesn't matter the fact that subsequently you are claiming for a fewer amount. If you look into the maximum, you had everyone on furlough, and so you will be able to, you won't have a limit on the number of people that you're processing in each particular claim. Paula, we have staff who are paid weekly and some paid monthly. Will we still be able to claim monthly, or will we have to be weekly? No, you can still claim monthly. It's a minimum claim period, but what you'll just have to make sure is that it can't span different calendar months. So it would have to, for example, in July's claim, it will have to start on the 1st of July, and it couldn't go into August, but it doesn't have to be. It's just the minimum period of claim. Ian has asked, the flexible furlough scheme refers to usual hours when calculating employees' furlough pay. What rate of pay do we apply to those hours? Well, it will still be the usual rate of pay. So you'd go back to, for example, the current scheme definitions of rate of pay, which is either the fixed, their fixed salary at the time furlough scheme came into being, or again, if it's variable, looking at the average pay that they received over, and again, it's quite a similar period. You take the higher of either the average over the last tax year or the corresponding calendar month. So there's no changes to how you actually calculate the rate of pay. Ian is asking, will citation provide approved letters to issue to staff where we request them to go into flexible furlough? Yes, indeed. We were working on that yesterday, having gone through the guidance. So we have produced a number of letters, some with a specific return to work date in mind, some getting employees agreement in advance of flexible furlough, just letting them so that, you've got the agreement in place. And therefore, if all of a sudden, let's say, for example, when a hospitality starts to open, if you suddenly think, oh, actually, there is a much greater demand than I thought there was going to be, you can get people back to work as quickly as possible. Laura's asked, how much notice do we need to give staff before asking them to work? And what if they say they can't? Our work can change hour by hour. So one morning we may have work come in and need someone that afternoon. Well, I do sympathise with that position. It's very much a question of balance. First of all, I think it's important to know that there is no minimum notice period set in the scheme rules. So this is going to be something which is governed by the basic rules of employment law, which of course continue to exist. Nothing in the job retention scheme changes basic rules of employment law, and that is that you should be reasonable. And therefore, I've got to say it may be questionable of actually phoning someone up in the morning and saying, right, I need you in 2 hours' time. I suppose it depends on how frequently your demand would change on a normal basis. What is the normal way you would notify employees? So, for example, if before the pandemic, they were used to being asked to come in at very short notice, then effectively nothing's changed. That's still the way you work. It may be, however, that you would prefer to bring people in, and then if you don't need them, send them back. You could still furlough them for the remainder of those hours. Just try to be as reasonable as possible. Gemma's asked, can some employees stay on full furlough and some move on to flexible furlough? Yes, absolutely. And I suppose in those circumstances, you'll face the same considerations you would have done when deciding who to furlough in the first place. You want to be as fair as possible. So you will look at the situation of, for example, if you have the ability to bring some people back and you have got the time to do that, it would be a good idea to speak to your employees and say, look, we are going to start bringing people back to work. Do you have any particular thoughts about whether, are you fine for coming back to work now? Would you rather be one of the first people back, or would you rather us keep you to the end? Because, of course, don't assume what people want. A lot of people think that people who are at home looking after children, would not perhaps want to come back because of their childcare responsibilities and, of course, the continuing issues we've got in terms of getting children back into school. But that may be wrong. Maybe they're absolutely itching to get back into work. And so therefore, put it out to everybody. For those who are concerned about coming back to work because maybe they're clinically vulnerable, or they live with someone who's shielding, or they have childcare issues, and you can keep them to the end of the list of people coming back, those are definitely very good reasons to take into account. Obviously, you've got to match up everyone's competing interests in that. But ask the question, first of all. If there's no determining factor there, of course, there may be people who are more flexible in a skill sense that you want to bring back. So, for example, if you are a restaurant and you've got someone who can act as waiting staff, has experience of working in a bar, has experience of working in the kitchen, you may want to bring them back before other people who can actually just do one task for you. So the key thing is that you give it some thought. If you're selecting who to choose to bring back, you give it some thought, and you have written down somewhere the basis on which you made that decision. It's not necessarily to share with anyone. It's just that if someone came across you afterwards and said, well, I think, you treated me inconsistently there, I think you were discriminating against me, you can show the thought process that you went through in actually coming to that decision. Tanita has asked, can you claim furlough during a notice period of redundancy? Yes, you can. It's a very, very popular question at the minute. There's absolutely no problem with that. Obviously, there are a couple of rules to bear in mind. First of all, this will not apply if you're paying in lieu of notice. So if you made someone redundant who had 5 years service and they were entitled to 5 weeks notice under their contract, you would have to keep them on your books and continue to claim furlough pay for them during those 5 weeks. You couldn't pay in lieu of notice and then recover that from the scheme because they're no longer in your employment. Secondly, there's a question of what you actually have to pay. So the presumption would be, there's quite complex rules about this, but the presumption would be that if they're furloughed, you will pay normal pay during the notice period. The law does protect employees in various circumstances where they're not receiving normal pay to their right to full pay during the notice period. And one of those situations is where they're ready and willing to work, but the employer is not able to provide work to them. So they then have a right to full pay for their statutory notice period. So, for example, if their contractual notice period is longer, it's only the statutory notice period that is actually protected. So that would mean you would have to top up the remaining 20% during their notice period. There is an exception to that. Again, it's a good thing to take advice just so you know exactly what you're doing. There's an exception to that where if under your contract, you are paying the employee or you have to give the employee at least a week's notice over and above their statutory entitlement, then that payment protection doesn't apply. So arguably in those circumstances, you could continue to pay the 80%. So let me give you an example of that. If for example, the employee's contract said they were entitled to a month's notice, but they had 2 years service. So under the statutory scheme, they would only be entitled to 2 weeks notice. Think of it as a reward for being particularly generous in your contractual terms. If at that point, because you're giving more than a week's contractual notice above the statutory notice, there's no right to have full pay during the notice period. So arguably, you could continue to pay 80%. One thing I'd say about that is, of course, everything has moved so quickly in terms of the scheme, and we have no idea how tribunals are going to interpret these rules when they actually when they come in front of them. And the reality is these cases are unlikely to come before employment tribunals for certainly the next 12, 18 months, 2 years. And by that point, everyone will have made all their significant decisions. A lot of commentators think, maybe tribunals will try to give employees on furlough that extra protection regardless of those extra contractual rights. And if your restrictive covenants are very important to you, it would be worthwhile playing safe and topping up anyway, because the argument will be if you pay 80%, that's a breach of contract, and therefore the restrictive covenants will fall away. As I say, on normal employment law principles, you should be fine paying 80%, but there's a big question mark about how tribunals might try to bend the rules to actually help employees out in this situation. So if you think, what's most important to me is to preserve those restrictive covenants, I would, from a practical point of view, I would top up and not take the chance. John has asked, do we agree flexi hours on a weekly basis is required? Do we need it weekly in writing? You don't need to put it weekly in writing, as long as you've got an alternative means of communicating with your employees, as long as you have got that agreement in principle to be flexibly furloughed, and that makes it very clear that the work will change, the flow of work will change. So there may be times when they're fully furloughed and there's no work, and there may be other times when the work will be available. So it's unpredictable. They're not able to say, but this is essentially what they're agreeing to, and you are going to offer work as and when you can. If your normal means of communication is that you would phone them up and let them know, there's certainly no need to be reiterating in this in writing all the time. But then a lot of employers are communicating very frequently on the basis of email. So it's just the normal means of communication, but no need to actually set out the new terms in writing every time if they are going to vary, regularly. As I say, this is all subject to the fact that we haven't seen the Treasury direction yet, but my view at the moment would be, if that agreement to furlough makes all of this very clear, then that will protect you going forward. Let me see. Ian, if we're making one claim per calendar month, are we allowed to hold on to the money from the last week of the previous month onto the employee's usual pay date, or are we expected to pass it straight away? No, you can pay it as normal, as long as, of course, when your pay date is due, you are paying on the entire amount that you've claimed. Ellie, do we have to declare a redundancy situation if we end furlough on 31st July and have no hours for the next 2 months? As a hospitality business, we have no idea what the demand is going to be, and we don't know what the social distancing rules will be. Well, I absolutely sympathise with you. I mean, I do a briefing for the business on the press conference every night, and certainly the debate about distancing rules is so frustrating. Obviously now the Prime Minister has announced there's going to be this comprehensive review, but certainly at least for the last couple of weeks, it's been raised, on a regular basis at the press conferences. And we've been told repeatedly that this is kept constantly under review. And obviously now we've got other countries who are adopting, lesser distancing, and the World Health Organization is saying 1 meter. So I absolutely understand your frustration, and the fact that, potentially we could be looking at businesses opening on the 4th of July and still not know what those rules are going to be for sure. But in terms of your question about the flexibility and declaring a redundancy situation, that's really a difficult decision for you to make as a business. So what is going to be that from the 1st of August, there will be a financial contribution you've got to make, although it is only going to be the employer's national insurance contributions and the pension contribution for August. But that is something that you will have to pay for your employees on furlough. But you don't have to. You don't have to take them. You don't have to declare a redundancy situation. It will be for you to decide as a business, do we want to make some permanent changes now, or do we want to give it a bit more time? There are a lot of businesses I know who are going to take the risk and actually make that financial contribution to furlough pay, just because it's very important for them to be able to bring people back in, and they're just literally keeping an eye on it on a week-by-week basis. But of course, you do also have to factor in that you will probably want to get the benefit of the furlough scheme for your notice pay. So factor in the notice, the pay that you'll have to pay for the employees as well when it comes to the point where you absolutely have to make your decision. So it's for you to decide, has it come to the point now where it is critical that we cut it off? Now, most citation clients will have a clause in their contract which says that they can put employees on layoff. or short-time working. Now, and layoff was, before furlough was thought of, this was a whole new concept in employment law that was created in March. Before then, layoff was the contractual right, and you didn't need to have it in your contract or get the employees to agree it in writing, where you could send people home without work and without pay. And in those circumstances, they only received up to 5 days statutory guarantee pay in a 13-week period, and statutory guarantee pay from April went up to £30 a day. So it was a very, very minimum income requirement. There is a question mark of, and as I say, I float this just to make you aware of it, because we have no idea how a tribunal would view this. There is a question mark about whether you could take people off furlough and put them onto layoff if you're saying, I can't afford to make this contribution. So the only way I can avoid making these people redundant is actually if I take them off furlough and I put them on layoff. Now that's quite a hard decision to make because although the saving for the business in August will be relatively small, the impact for the employee will be very significant. So there is a big risk there that would be seen as potentially a breach of trust and confidence, which could arguably allow the employee to say that they're being constructively dismissed. There's all sorts of potential legal ramifications there. So it's not something that I would rush into. If you are considering doing it, it would be something that you'd want to take a lot of advice on to weigh up what is the financial impact on the business. But ultimately, if you're saying keeping people on furlough is not really a financial step I can take. So I make them redundant now, or I try to retain their employment as much as possible by putting them on layoff. That's a sort of argument you could potentially argue, but as I said, it is certainly not without risk. Michelle has said, from 1st July, can we bring someone back full-time for a week and potentially put them back on furlough for less than the 3-week period? Yes, absolutely. That 3-week period is going from the 1st of July. So there is no minimum furlough period from the 1st of July. But as I said, do bear in mind that people who started their furlough, obviously not for the first time because they've got to already be in the scheme by the 10th of June. But if you started a new period of furlough for that employee less than 3 weeks before the end of June, they have got to serve out the remainder of that 3 weeks before you can put them on flexible furlough. So someone starting on the 25th of June will have to do 3 consecutive weeks under the old scheme for furlough before they can move to the new flexible scheme. But after that, yes, no minimum period at all. So Gemma, I'm not sure if this question's come through again. My staff started back in June on a part-time basis after being on furlough since 22nd of March. Can I claim flexible furlough from 1st of June? No, you will only be able to claim flexible furlough from the 1st of July, but you will be able to claim flexible furlough from the 1st of July. Katie, we have 2 staff furloughed now. Can we bring back one and flexi furlough another in July? So still 2, but different staff members. Yes, absolutely. You can, as long as you are not exceeding the number of the maximum number of staff that you furloughed before, there's no problem with that. And it doesn't matter that they are different staff members, as long as you remember you can only claim for a staff member who has already been furloughed under the scheme, unless it's that maternity or statutory family leave exception that we're talking about. Jill has asked, will the flexible furlough letters be in Atlas? Yes, there will be. We'll be getting those up at some point over the next couple of days, and you'll be able to download them then. Jill has asked, should you enforce planned holidays for furloughed staff? Well, you can do. And a lot of employers see the benefit of this. I suppose it swings and roundabouts, really. The benefit of it is that it's using up holidays, and you are able to claim furlough pay for the time they're on holiday. So that is 80% contribution towards holiday, which you would have had to pay anyway. And particularly, for example, if you may be looking at redundancies and employees haven't used up their holiday, you'll be then paying them for a holiday that they have accrued but not taken, although you can require employees to take holiday during their notice period if you've given sufficient notice. So that is the good thing about requiring employees to take holiday during furlough. You get to reclaim the 80% of the costs. The downside of it is that, first of all, you have got to top up, so they should receive their full pay during holiday. That's very clear. We've always thought that was the case, but the government have actually issued guidance on that now and said, yes, you do have to top up that remaining 20%. And the second point is a rather more subtle, and that is that, well, there's two aspects of it, actually. First of all, it's not entirely engaging for employees to be required to take holidays at the moment because, of course, they are still quite restricted in what they can do. So there is an engagement issue there. You may want to think about that. There is also the fact that, and the government have made reference to this in the guidance, they've said employers should give thought to whether or not an employee can truly enjoy their holiday at a time during the pandemic, because obviously I know it's getting a little bit easier now as restrictions are being eased, but prior to then it was very you're very, very limited in what you could do. And I think that reference in the guide was a reference back to some of the case law we've seen on where employers have tried to require employees to take holiday when they're on sick leave. And the fact is, well, the whole point about having a holiday is to relax and enjoy yourself. And you can't really do that when you're on sick leave. And a similar argument would be, can you really enjoy a holiday and get the benefits of a holiday when you're on furlough? That's something, it's just a pointer in the guidance because we have no idea how tribunals will actually look at that. Another point to remember as well is if you are going to require your employees to take holiday, you need to give them twice as much notice of the actual, as the length of the holiday you require them to take. So if you wanted them to take a week's holiday, so you would have to give them 2 weeks notice of that. So that needs to be factored in. Laura said, if a staff member is due to work, then calls in sick for those hours, can we put them back on furlough for those hours? It's a very, very good question. I suspect the temptation will be, if this is a one-off, that you may just chalk that down to hours they didn't actually work. And there is reference to the fact that although the furlough scheme is not really intended to include, normal sickness absence, you can put employees on sick leave on furlough. If this is going to be an ongoing situation, I think you would have to maybe review that. But if it's just, I can't make this afternoon session because I'm sick, then it might be tempted just to actually class those as review the calculation of hours actually worked. Of course, it's going to be very important for you to keep a record of all of this because you need to make sure that your claims are matching the actual hours worked. Tanita's asked, from the 1st of July, can I claim more than once during July for weekly paid employees, or do I have to wait and make a claim for a 4-week period? No, you can claim every week. The only changes in relation to claim periods are the changes of that it's got to be a minimum claim period of 7 days. That claim period must start and end in the same calendar month. And the only reason it can be for less than than 7 days, as if you're sort of mopping up a furlough period, which is either a couple of days at the beginning or the end of a month. Those are the only rules, so you can still continue to claim as you did. Kay has asked, do you know how flexible furlough will work regarding company car tax? If an employee only works 2 days a week, for example, and does not use their car for personal use, does that affect the amount of tax paid? Well, I'm afraid I'm not a tax expert, but actually I am doing a session on flexible furlough with a firm of accountants. I think it's on the 6th of July. I know we're going to be promoting it through social media. So this is exactly the sort of question that they'll be able to answer for you. Just go through some of these questions. Michelle, I'm going through some of the earlier questions that I missed. Are we able to use the flexible furlough scheme for employees who have previously been furloughed but subsequently returned and currently still in the business? Yes, absolutely. Doesn't matter the fact that you've brought them back either full-time or part-time, as long as they have done their 3 consecutive weeks furlough between the 1st of March and the 30th of June, you can flexibly furlough them. Ian, where a pay period ends partway through a month, do we claim for the whole month in one go, possibly claiming in advance for part of it, or do we make 2 claims? So yeah, you should try so far as possible to make your claims matching the pay period, but it doesn't matter if you are going a few days in advance of that's not a problem. But as long as you are not, as I say, from the 1st of July, spanning different calendar months. Ellie said, for hospitality, if we decided to stop furlough as at 1st August, I think we might have answered this question later on the basis of the changes to the scheme, where would we stand? Well, as I said, you then have to look at whether you're making permanent changes to the business by way of following a redundancy process, or whether you might want to look at other alternatives, which potentially, you've got the right to lay off, could be in there. But as I say, I can't stress enough, if you were to be removing furlough pay and putting someone on essentially statutory guarantee pay, which is virtually nothing, in order to be able to show that's reasonable, you would really need to show that the financial impact on the business is such that you just couldn't, you couldn't keep them on furlough. Paul asked, I have 2 engineers, can I keep one redundant but keep the other on furlough? Yes, you can, but you would have to go through all the normal rules with regard to redundancy haven't changed. So you would need to go through a proper redundancy consultation process, and that would mean consulting with both. There would be in a pool, you'd have to have selection criteria. That would be a fair way of selecting between the 2 of them. You couldn't just say, well, for example, sometimes you'll have people who are on furlough and other people who are working. You couldn't say, well, the ones who are furlough, we've managed without them, it's worked fine, I'm going to make the ones who are on furlough redundant. You would have to follow a fair process of selecting. We've got a question here. If I put my employee on furlough before the end of June, can I move them to flexible furlough on the 1st of July? Yes, as I said, no problem, but only from the time that they have served their 3 weeks, because any furlough period that started before the 30th of June is subject to the old rules. So you need to have that 3-week consecutive period of furlough. Can I use the furlough scheme to fund redundancy package for employees? Yes, as I say, notice you can do as long as you've kept them on your books, but not the actual redundancy payment. That will be something that as a business you have to meet yourself. We see lots of clients who approach us at the minute who know that they've got to make redundancies, but actually after several months of lockdown, financially they just can't afford to make those payments. There's a couple of options for you in those situations. You can either be quite upfront with your employees at the point where you made them redundant and actually explain the financial difficulties the business is in and come and ask them if you can pay over time. They're obviously not going to be thrilled at that. They're not going to be thrilled at having been made redundant. So, but it may work if you're talking about making a payment, splitting the payment over a couple of months. It may be something they agree to because all the remedies available to them are going to be, take a year for them to, at least minimum, I would say, to get to a final decision. Alternatively, the redundancy payment service can arrange, if you can show that you actually you're not actually in an insolvency situation, so you are still trading, but you're not able to make those payments. They can arrange to make the redundancy payment direct to the employee, but you will have to pay them back at some point. Jill has said, am I understanding correctly that the furlough scheme will effectively pay redundancy costs? No, not redundancy pay. So on a redundancy, you have three things which you would have to pay. If you made someone redundant, you will have to pay their notice. You will have to pay the redundancy payment if they've been with you for over 2 years, and that's based on their length of service and their age on a multiplier, and there's a statutory maximum for that. So it's a redundancy payment, which is paid tax-free. And you will also have to pay, as you would do in any situation when you bring someone's employment to an end, a payment for any holiday which they have accrued but not taken. So the redundancy payment, you'll have to pay yourself. The holidays accrued but not taken, because in fact you're paying that in lieu of taking the holidays, you would have to pay that yourself. But if you keep them on the books for the notice period, you can continue to claim the furlough subsidy throughout the length of that notice period. Obviously, if they haven't got any accrued holiday, that's not that hasn't been taken, and if they've been with you for less than 2 years, they don't get a redundancy payment. So notice is essentially all they're entitled to. So in that sense, yes, you'd be able to claim it because you'll be recovering the 80%. But remember, as I say, the general rule, unless you've got these extra contractual terms in terms of notice, you've got that generosity built in, there is the right to full pay, so you'll have to top up the 80% during the notice pay. So Jeremy, if an employee has booked annual leave and was on flexi furlough at the time, can we claim? Yes, this is something which they haven't actually addressed. So if I would say that when you are looking at the hours they work, you would keep the hours they work separate, and you would so for example, you wouldn't include the hours of holiday in hours worked because they're not actually working for you. You would keep that under the flexible furlough. So that would be something which you would still claim because they're not actually working on during that time. It may be because the government have said that because of the extraordinary circumstances we're living through, they're going to keep the rules on holiday reviewed. But at the moment, I would say they're not actually working in those hours. So I would treat the hours that they're on holiday as part of the flexible furlough hours. Brian has said, I've already put a signifying number of my employees on short-time hours since April. Does that mean from July I can keep these employees on short-time hours but can claim through the flexible furlough scheme for the hours they're not working? Yes, absolutely. As long as they have done their 3 weeks consecutive furlough at some point before the 30th of June, and it's not going to bring you over the maximum number of employees you can bring in a claim, which, for example, if you essentially shut down your business at one point and had furloughed everybody, you should safely be under that. The fact that you have brought them back in the meantime means that, yes, you can put them on flexible furlough. You can pay them for the hours they're working and claim furlough subsidy for those remaining hours. So really, essentially, the point about the rules are that they are allowing you the flexibility to bring people back to work as and when it suits the needs of the business. And I think that's all we've got time for this morning. Thanks again so much for joining me, and thanks for all your questions. If you have got any further questions, you can always contact us at citation.co.uk/Facebook, or if you can contact us by telephone on 0161 333 1652. Thanks again for joining me, and have a great day. Bye-bye.